This is Paige, Riley, and Neeraj's Physics Lab Report 3. Our experimental question in this experiment was, what is the relationship between frictional force and kinetic energy? Our hypothesis is that when frictional forces increase, kinetic energy would be decreased due to the change in velocity. Velocity will decrease when frictional forces increase, meaning that change in velocity will decrease kinetic energy. We will prove this hypothesis through an experimental procedure including an IO lab and a ramp with two different surfaces, altering the frictional force. Our experimental procedure is as follows. First, we set up a ramp using a whiteboard and kept the ramp at the same height of 8.4 inches throughout the whole experiment to keep it consistent. Second, we used an IO lab to measure the maximum velocity, which would lead us to calculate the kinetic energy and would allow us to relate kinetic energy to that frictional force. Third, we changed the surface of the whiteboard by using both Clorox wipes to grease down the whiteboard to make it more slippery and a towel to manipulate the friction on the IO lab and to evaluate the values at two different surfaces. Last, we used the graphs we got from the IO lab program to then calculate our different kinetic energy values and then to relate those back to the surface of the whiteboard for friction. Here is some background information on kinetic energy and frictional force. Kinetic energy is the energy that an object retains due to motion. This value is dependent on velocity and mass, so the higher value for either velocity or mass indicates a higher value for kinetic energy. The equation is shown on the top on the right hand of the screen. Frictional force is a resistive force that deals with the surface that the object is moving on. A more resistive surface increases the force of friction, making an object move slower and usually not as far. The equation is shown on the bottom of the right hand of the screen.
Newton's second law is shown in the free body diagrams because the acceleration is going up in the direction that the forces are imbalanced, meaning that the force of friction is not as strong as the force of gravity in the x direction. And the conservation of energy is shown in the energy pie charts because for each trial, the charts stay the same size, and it's only the little portions that change size.
Also, our system schemas are shown in this model. In the system schema, when we did the trial with the Clorox wipes, the only things included in the system were the IO lab, the earth, and the ramp. But for the trials where we used the towel, the IO lab, the earth, and the ramp, and also the towel were included in our system schema.
IOLAB software provides us with the position, velocity, and acceleration of the IOLAB at any given time. When components and graphs between trials, we find that since the grease trial allowed for higher maximum velocity compared to the towel trial, we extrapolated that higher frictional force is created by a lower maximum velocity.
The fact that the greased ramp indicated a higher maximum velocity goes along with our idea that frictional force and kinetic energy have in fact an inverse relationship because the less frictional force that was implemented on the ramp caused a higher maximum velocity, which then in turn would create a higher kinetic energy value.
So we got the velocity values from the IOLab software, and we plugged these values into the kinetic energy equation and got those values from that.
The kinetic energy equation that we used was 1/2 mv squared.
Due to limited runway space, the window of data collection is minimal, which may result in a sample size too small for statistical significance. Another error exists in the fitting of the whiteboard with the towel. If there were bumps in the towel track, the IOLab would have picked up extra data, possibly providing skewed results.
Overall, our hypothesis was proven to be correct. Through analyzing the data from the IO lab, we can tell that the kinetic energy would be greater for systems with a lower frictional force. The coefficient of friction is higher in the trials with the towel because the frictional force is a lot stronger, meaning the coefficient is higher. We determined that when the frictional force is less, the velocity of the IO lab would be higher, meaning that the kinetic energy would be higher. And this is how we connected both the frictional force and the kinetic energy to each other, determining that they, in fact, have an inverse relationship.